So now it is my pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Vanessa Bohns. And she's been a faculty member in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations since the fall of 2014, where she's currently a professor and chair of the Organizational Behavior Department. She received her undergraduate degree from Brown University and a PhD from Columbia. A social psychologist, she has a rare talent in that she has published a long list of important papers in leading academic journals in psychology, management, and law, and has published pieces and seen her work cited in important newspapers and general interest publications, such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Atlantic. Put simply, she is both an accomplished academic researcher and seeks to convey what her research has taught her to the public. Vanessa is an expert in the areas of help-seeking, influence, compliance, consent, and why it is so hard to say no. She teaches a wide variety of classes in ILR, undergraduate and master's level. She works with and teaches PhD students and participates in ILR's eCornell program in human resource management. She's received high praise in all the classes she teaches. She's also a dedicated citizen of both the ILR school and the university. Ron says it's been a pleasure to have served with her on the Faculty Senate Financial Policy Committee during the last few years before he formally retired. Vanessa's talk today is based on her 2021 book, You Have More Influence Than You Think. Vanessa's research demonstrates that people see us, listen to us, and agree to do things for us much more than we realize. She will explain to us today that rather than seeking ways to gain more influence, we should become more mindful of how we are using the influence we already have. So please welcome Vanessa Bohns.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, Ron, if you're out there, for the lovely introduction, and Christina for filling in there. I'm so excited to be here with you today to talk a little bit about my research. I do study influence, but as you'll see, I study it in a slightly different way than people tend to. Hopefully that will become apparent, but I'll kind of circle back to that at the end. I like to start with a book that I assume everyone in the audience, if not, maybe most people, but I'd say everyone is familiar with. So, How to Win Friends and Influence People. I assume that pretty much everyone has heard of this book. Do you know when it was published? Any guesses as to the year it was published? I heard 49. I heard 60s. 1955, 1936. I know. And I won't make a joke about how many of you got to read it when it came out. I guess that was the joke. So 1936, this book came out. And as an author myself now who's written a book on influence, I kind of look at the rankings on Amazon and other places to see how my book is doing and how that book is doing. And this book from 1936 is almost always in the top 100, which I can assure you my book will never reach. And this is how many years later. So it's an incredibly popular book and an incredibly popular topic. So after this book was published, in the years since, and even, each new year brings a new book like this, there's been tons more books published on influence and basically how to get more of it. This to me presents a real conundrum, because if you kind of look at this as data, you see that people are buying up these books, attending seminars, reading articles on how to get influence as if they have no idea how to do it, right? It's as if we all just don't know how to influence people and win friends. And so we need all these resources and tips and tricks to figure it out. That's kind of what this data suggests. But I'm a social psychologist, and I sort of came up academically reading about all the ways that we have a ton of influence over other people. Anyone who knows the basic sort of social psychology findings from early on can think of the infamous Milgram studies, right? The obedience studies, where an experimenter can get another person to essentially shock someone, right? And think that they're actually harming them. The other famous studies are the Solomon Asch studies, where people are influenced by their surroundings to actually say that they see something, in this case, lines of different lengths, that they aren't actually seeing. So there's tons of findings in social psychology that suggest we have a ton of influence over other people. So why is it that we are constantly gravitating towards these messages that we don't have influence, that we need to figure out how to have influence? And so my research is really on that disconnect and trying to reconcile it. And it really looks at these misperceptions we have of our own influence. So our tendency to have a bias towards underestimating the influence we have. So this is how I look at influence differently. Instead of looking at how we can influence people more or less, I look at how we feel about our own influence, our own intuitions and predictions of our influence, and whether they match reality. And so this all started when I was a graduate student at Columbia in New York City. And I started my PhD, I was in my first year, and I was working with a professor there at the business school. And we were studying sort of traditional influence topics. We wanted to see whether someone would be more likely to agree if we asked something one way or another. I don't even remember the exact details of the hypothesis. But we decided we wanted to collect data from sort of an ordinary sample of people. So we didn't want to just go onto the Columbia campus. We wanted to go and find people of different ages, of different ethnicities, and different sort of life experiences. And so we decided I was going to go down to Penn Station to collect this data. So I would get on the subway every day, take it down to Penn Station, walk out into a bustling, train station, go up to random people and say, will you fill out my questionnaire? And I did this day after day to hundreds of people, and it still has traumatized me to walk into Penn Station. It was so awful, just having to ask people for things day after day. So I do this, I collect the data, we finish the study, I bring the data back to the professor I was working with, we enter it, we analyze it, and guess what? The study didn't work. So I had spent days just with this anxiety in my stomach, asking people for things for nothing. So I mentioned this to my professor, that this was particularly devastating. Studies don't always work. I mean, scientists know that, right? And I expect that, but it was just so painful because of what I felt like I had gone through to get that data. And as I was describing the pain of this experience, my professor, Frank, was looking at the data we had entered. I had written down how many people said yes to me. I had written down anything they said in response to me. And so I was saying out loud to him my own internal experience. It was awful. It was painful. I hated asking people for things. And he was looking at the data and saying, most people were agreeing, though. People were actually being polite when they said no. And so we kind of had this aha moment where we realized that the experience I had in my head was very different from what had been happening in reality. I was experiencing this as this painful, difficult thing, when in fact, people were being pretty influenced by me and pretty kind, right? Pretty positive, even if they said no. And so we wondered if that was sort of my own unique experience and maybe my own neuroticism or something, or whether it was something that other people similarly experienced. So we decided to start conducting studies based on my experience in Penn Station. The first one we did, we brought participants into the lab. Again, I'm an experimental social psychologist, so my studies tend to involve bringing people into the lab. And we had them do the exact thing that I did in Penn Station. We gave them a stack of questionnaires, and we said, what we're going to have you do is go out onto campus and ask people you don't know to fill out questionnaires. So you're going to go up to people. We're going to give you a specific script. You don't change the script. You don't try to persuade them in any different way. You just walk up to someone you don't know, and say, will you fill out a questionnaire? Now, before they went out and did this, we asked them, how many people do you think you're going to need to ask before 5 people agree to fill out a questionnaire? So they had to get 5 people to agree, and we asked them how many they thought they would need to ask for that to happen. So this is what we found. So this is what we asked people. How many people will you need to ask to get 5 to agree? Sorry, the heading is being covered a little bit. They thought they would need to ask about 20 people before 5 would agree. Then they went out and did this, kept track of the actual number of people they needed to ask. And it turned out they only needed to ask about 10 people to get 5 to agree. So they had over predicted how difficult this task was going to be by about twice as much. So at this point, we wondered if maybe this had something to do with filling out questionnaires. Maybe this is just a really fun thing that people love to do. And that was the phenomenon we were capturing. Of course, we wanted to show that it was broader than that. And so we decided to replicate this study using different kinds of requests. So this is the same data I just showed you, just plotted on a graph instead. So this was the first study where participants thought they would need to ask about 20 people before 5 would agree. They actually had to ask about 10 people before 5 would agree to fill out a questionnaire. We ran another study where we had our participants go out and ask to borrow strangers' cell phones. And so they would go up to someone and say, I'm in an experiment and I need to call the experimenter back at the lab. And when someone agreed to hand them their phone, they would actually call us back in the lab so we could see the number and everything. And they had to get 3 unique numbers. So they had to call us back in the lab from 3 unique phones. So they thought that they would have to ask about 10 people before 3 people would agree to loan them their phones. They actually ended up needing to ask about 6 people before 3 would agree. So a similar finding. In another study, we decided to take advantage of the fact that the Columbia campus has this underground gym that's kind of hard to find. So you could easily walk by the gym and have no idea it was there. So we brought our participants to the other side of campus, away from the gym, so down on the south side of campus, and we had them ask strangers to walk them to the gym. So they had to go up to someone and say, I can't find the gym. I was just up there. Can you just walk me over there and show me where the entrance is? It was a pretty believable cover story given how hard the gym is to find. They had to get one person to do this because if they agreed, they had to walk this person a few city blocks all the way back up to the gym. Our participants thought they would need to ask about 7 people before one person agreed to walk them to the gym. They actually had to ask around 2. So again, far fewer than they expected. In another study, we just wanted to see, what kind of random things can we have our participants ask people? So we put a bunch of pinto beans in jars, which still clutter our lab, and we are trying to find other studies we can run with pinto beans. But we had these jars full of beans, and in this case, we had our participants knock on dorm rooms of people they didn't know and say, for a class project, I have to get an accurate count of the beans in this jar. Will you count these for me? And so in this case, they had to get 2 people to agree to do this. They thought they would have to ask about 9 people. They actually had to ask closer to 4. Now, at this point, you may be thinking, these are just contrived, strange laboratory experiments. These are not things these people were planning on doing. And so we wanted to make sure that the same kind of phenomenon happened in situations where someone was actually planning on making a request. And we weren't just kind of forcing them to do something they weren't already going to do. So we teamed up with an organization called Team in Training. And this is part of the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And basically, you raise money to sponsor you for a race, for a marathon or a triathlon. So these are people who had already signed up to work with Team in Training. And they have these fundraising goals that range from $4,000 to $6,000. So they have to raise a certain amount of money to be able to participate. We asked them, how many people do you think you're going to have to ask before you reach your fundraising goals? They thought they would have to ask about 200 people. So these values, because they're larger, are times 10. They actually ended up needing to ask about 120, so closer to 100 people. So even in this context where people were already planning on making a request, and they were asking people they knew, acquaintances, colleagues, for example, they still underestimated how easy this task would be. right? Or they thought that people would say no to them essentially more than people actually did. So at this point, we thought we had a real phenomenon on our hands. We kept replicating this finding. And in fact, I've replicated it in various countries, in various states, and various situations, and it's just always there. This is a really strong finding. We've also looked at answers to a bunch of different questions that I tend to get at this point. So people ask if it matters who you ask. So for example, does it matter if I go up and ask a stranger on the street, or if I go and ask my friend who knows me much better? And as it turns out, it matters, but much less than we think. So we think that strangers are going to be much, much less likely to help us or agree to do things for us than our friends. But the difference is minimal when it comes to these small requests. We look at how you ask. So does it matter sort of how you phrase the request? And we find that very, very simple requests. You don't need to sort of push really hard or phrase something in a particularly charismatic way. Just a very basic request seems to have the same effect as kind of these more elaborate requests where we think we need to write out a whole kind of speech about why someone should agree to do something for us. People also ask if it matters what you ask. So they're usually thinking of kind of how big the request is. I'll show you some other contexts where we run these studies where it'll kind of show you that this replicates even with kind of wacky, more high stakes requests. But we've also done studies where we had our participants ask for a big request. So we gave them like a stack of papers to ask people to fill out, like when you're going to the doctor and you just get like the stack of papers. Or we had them just ask for like one little sheet of paper with 5 questions. Our participants thought that would make a big deal or a big difference. So they thought that participants, people would be much more likely to say no to this big request of a stack of papers than a small request. It actually didn't make any difference at all when they went out and asked people. The only difference we found so far that really, really, really affects compliance is whether you ask in person. And so I won't be talking about that more. Happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but if you email someone, even if you ask them over the phone or over Zoom, like video calls, it doesn't have the same effect. So this is very much like an in-person phenomenon. Now, you might wonder why a lot of these things don't make a difference, right? Why doesn't it matter how big or small the request is? Why doesn't it matter sort of the reasons you come up with for why someone should do something? And as it turns out, the reason it doesn't seem to matter as much as we think is that the reason we find that people agree to things more than we expect is that it's really hard for them to say no. If you imagine these requests from the other perspective, not from the perspective of someone who's making the request, but of the person on the other side, and you imagine someone coming up to you and asking you for something, asking you for a small favor or a bigger favor, it's really hard to say no to someone who's standing right in front of you asking you for something. It's awkward, it's uncomfortable, right? It's easier in many cases to just agree than to try to come up with the words to say no in the moment. But when we're the ones asking, we forget what it feels like to be in that perspective, in that position. And so we underestimate how hard it is for the other person to say no to us. And that leads us to think that they're much more likely to say no to us than they actually are. Because of that, it doesn't really matter how big the thing we're asking for is, because it's hard to say no to someone regardless of whether it's because they want us to, fill out a bunch of surveys or just one little survey. It's that same awkward interaction. The other interesting thing about this is that if the reason that people are agreeing to things more than we think or more than we expect is because it's hard to say no and not because they're just nicer than we think, which is what a lot of our participants were just like, people are just so nice, right? That's part of it, and other research has shown that. But in our research, it's because of this difficulty of saying no. And if that's the case, that means that we're going to see the same effects, even in situations where someone's not asking for help or a pro-social request, but they're actually asking for other kinds of things, maybe inappropriate requests. or unethical requests, because presumably it's also hard to say no in those circumstances as well. So we wanted to see if this was true. So we decided to expand the types of requests we had our participants ask for. Our first sort of foray into trying this was having participants ask someone to commit a white lie. So we told our participants, you're going to go out onto campus, and this time you're going to ask people to sign their name on a form saying that you gave this pitch for a new course that we're offering on campus that you don't want to give. So you're going to go up to people, we gave them a script, you're going to say, hey, I'm supposed to give this pitch to people telling you about this new course on campus. I really don't want to do it, so will you just sign this form saying that I gave you the pitch? So you're basically asking someone to sign their name on a form, lying for you. So in this case, we asked participants, how many people do you think you're going to have to ask before 3 people agree to lie for you? Then they went out and actually did this and kept track of how many people did. So these, I couldn't find a way to make this font that much bigger. So on the left is the data I already showed you. You're going to see basically the same pattern of results. So the gray bars are the predictions. This is how many people I think I'm going to need to ask. The pink bars are how many people you actually have to ask. On the left side are all the help requests. On the right side are going to be the unethical requests we add to this. So when we had our participants ask people to lie for them, they thought they would have to ask about 8.5 people before 3 people would agree to lie. They actually only had to ask about 4.5. So we see the same pattern, even though in this case, they're not asking for help, they're asking someone to lie for them. Now you could look at this situation and say, that person could convince themselves that they are helping this person, right? They could say, yeah, it's a lie, but I'm helping this person out, because what's the harm really in lying on this form and saying they gave a pitch that they didn't actually give, right? No harm, no foul. I can reinterpret it in my head as being an okay thing to do. So we wanted to identify a situation where it was really, really, really hard for anyone to convince themselves that they were doing something helpful. We wanted to come up with a request that our participants could ask that was clearly determined to be unethical by everyone involved, but that the ethics board would also let us use. So some things were tossed out right away. So what we decided to do was to have our participants go into libraries and ask strangers to vandalize library books. So we took a bunch of books off my bookshelf, so no actual library books were used. When this comes out in popular press from time to time, people think we used actual library books, and I get angry emails. No library books were actually vandalized. So these are books I took off my shelf, and my RAs and we put the codes on the spines of the books to make them look like library books, and we tried to mimic the university codes. And we gave them the books, and we said, you're going to go into the library, find a stranger, and say, hey, I'm playing a prank on my friend, but they know my handwriting. Will you just write the word pickle and pen in this library book? And they would hand them the library book, turn to a page, and a pen. In this case, they had to get 3 people to agree to vandalize library books, what they at least thought to be library books. And as I said, the reason we wanted to do this is so that if someone did this, they couldn't say, oh, I was just helping someone out. It was very clear that they were doing something wrong. And so we had our participants keep track of things that people said to them in response to make sure that they knew this was wrong. And so people would say things like, I'm not sure if I should, it's a library book. On a library book, whoa, only if I won't get into trouble. And pardon my French, but I hope you don't get into shit for this. So these are the things that people were saying in response when our participants were asking them to vandalize these library books. So clearly, they knew it was wrong. They were feeling conflicted about doing this thing. So we wanted to see if we found the same pattern of results, even when it was very clear that whatever was being asked was not pro-social, it was unethical. And so this is once again the data I've shown you so far, just so you have the pattern kind of in your mind of what the data has looked like so far. And this is what we found for the vandalism study. So participants thought they would have to ask, that's 10.7 people, so about 10.5 people to get 3 people to vandalize a library book. They actually only had to ask around 4.5. So a very similar pattern to what we've seen. And as we saw, people weren't happy to do it. They didn't say, oh, this is great fun, I'd love to vandalize this library book. They were conflicted, but it was easier to just do the thing they were being asked to do than to say no to that person who was standing in front of them. So we agree to do things even when we don't want to, because it's so hard to say no. So this, of course, applies to other contexts as well. One of them being the Me Too movement and dating and sexual harassment. So in follow-up studies, we've looked at how these same kinds of dynamics play out in those situations as well. So this is a comedian and actor, Aziz Ansari, who's been on the show Parks and Recreation, among other things. And when Me Too stories started to come out sort of en masse, and we heard about a lot of truly horrible things, this story was really interesting because it was in many ways the story of some people would argue sort of a bad date, where the stakes seemed lower than in some of these other sort of horrifying contexts, and yet it was so sort of relatable to so many people that it generated a ton of debate, a ton of articles, and people were talking about it constantly. And so what happened was that a woman went on a date with this comedian and actor, Aziz Ansari, and she was interviewed by a website where she told this website that essentially it turned into the worst night of her life. This woman, she didn't give her real name, she used the pseudonym of Grace. She said that she was using verbal and nonverbal cues to indicate how uncomfortable and distressed she was. But Aziz Ansari said that he was surprised and concerned and believed that this encounter that he had had with this woman had been completely consensual. So in some ways you can look at this and say, it looks like this classic sort of he said, she said, right? He's saying, this seems like a completely consensual situation. She's saying, I was being pressured. So who do we believe? That's often the way these kinds of things are phrased. Which person is right, right? He said, she said. We took a different stance to sort of understanding these kinds of situations. So this is one example, but as we sort of scoured the internet and talked to people who work in the Title IX office at the university, this is a really, really common theme, that one person says, I was pressured, and the other person says, you could have said no, right? And you never really did. And so we get this kind of similar dynamic that we've been seeing in our study so far. So we asked, instead of individual one-off he said, she said situations, is there actually a systematic bias that occurs in these kinds of situations where the person who's being sort of pressured or asked out, for example, feels like they can't say no, but the person doing the asking doesn't recognize that feeling. They don't realize the pressure they're putting on that person. So very similar to asking someone to vandalize a library book, we think you'll just say no if you don't want to do it, but it's actually much harder to do than we realize when we're not in that situation. So we wanted to see if we could sort of capture that dynamic as well in our studies. And because we couldn't, again, ethics board, has some rules, so we can't just send people onto campus to sexually harass people. Instead, we decided to do sort of the best things that we could to recreate situations like this. So one of the things we did was to give people a survey and have them read hypothetical vignettes where they either imagine themselves in the position of being asked out by a coworker. So you know that this coworker is interested in you romantically. One day you're working with them and they ask you out on a date. They ask you out to dinner. Or you're randomly assigned to read the situation from the other perspective, and you read a situation about how you're interested in this other person, you're working late, and you ask them out on a date. So you're either reading the perspective of the person who's asking someone out, we call these the suitors, or the person who's being asked, we call these the targets. Then we asked both parties a series of questions about how hard it would be for that target to say no in that situation. So these are the answers that the suitors provided, And the DVs, the dependent variables on the bottom of this say difficult, bad, uncomfortable, and guilty. So this is, if I ask someone out, here's where I rate them as how difficult it would be to say no to me, how bad they would feel, how uncomfortable they would feel saying no to me, and how guilty they would feel saying no to me. From the target perspective, the targets on each of these variables said it would be more difficult, they'd feel more bad, they'd feel more uncomfortable, and they'd feel more guilty than the suitor imagined they would feel. So we're seeing the systematic bias we predicted, where if you are the one who's kind of simulating being in the experience of having to say no to someone who's asking you out, you are better able to recognize how hard it is to do that. Now, the problem with hypothetical vignettes, of course, is that they're hypothetical. So you ask the question of, would this happen in the real world? And so we also did a recall study where we asked people to respond to a survey about a situation that they had actually experienced, where someone in their workplace had either asked them out and they weren't interested in this person, or they were interested in someone else, one of their coworkers, that they pursued and found out that they weren't interested. And we emailed this survey to, or we actually got responses from about 1,000 STEM graduate students at Cornell. So these were students who kind of were in STEM fields where women often find themselves sort of pushed out. And one of the sort of reasons for that is often issues around sexual harassment from either peers or from superiors in their programs or in the field. So we thought this was a particularly important context to look at these dynamics in. So in this case, we identified groups of people who had this experience. And if they had, we asked them about the experience they had had. So once again, these gray bars are suitors, which means these are people who said, I was interested in someone in my lab or in my field. I pursued them romantically, and they weren't interested in me. And these are their responses to how bad, difficult, uncomfortable, guilty they thought that person felt saying no. And you compare that to the targets. So these are the people who were pursued, who said, yeah, this person asked me out and I wasn't interested in them. And once again, across all the variables, people who had to say no to someone they weren't interested in said it was harder than the person imagined it was, more difficult, they felt worse, they felt more uncomfortable, and they felt more guilty. So once again, we're seeing this sort of systematic bias. Interestingly, there wasn't a gender difference in the bias itself. So it didn't matter if you were a man or a woman pursuing the other person, you still kind of missed how the pressure you were putting on them and how uncomfortable you were making them. But women were 4 times as likely to actually experience the position of target than men. So even though the dynamics, once you were in this situation, were similar, it affected women much more frequently. We also wondered, do these have downstream behavioral effects? So we asked people either if the person they had pursued changed their behavior after this pursuit. So did they avoid the person? Did they talk to someone about it? Did they waste energy thinking about this? Did their productivity suffer? Did they avoid the lab? And did they even go as far as considering switching careers or switching labs? And we also asked targets these same questions. And what we found is in most of those behavioral consequences as well, targets said, yeah, I avoided that person, but suitors were like, I don't think they were avoiding me. So they missed a lot of the behavioral consequences. And there can be very innocuous reasons for that, right? We just don't see someone else's behaviors, especially if they're avoiding us. But they still missed sort of the downstream repercussions of this dynamic. So this has sort of taken my research in a new path, looking at romantic advances, because when you talk about romantic advances, the issue of consent becomes front and center, particularly when you're talking about how hard it is to say no to romantic advances. And interestingly, while romantic and sexual contexts are usually the first thing people think of with consent, consent applies to so many different contexts. So every time we sign an employment contract, we're consenting. Every time we download an app on our phone or computer, we're consenting. Every time you get medical treatment, you're consenting. Participating in research, even when someone just asks for something informally. And the last sort of section I'm going to talk to you about is searches. So if you go to the airport and you have your bag searched, or if a police officer stops you and asks to search your car, All of those situations are situations involving consent. So the last sort of thing I'm going to talk about is where my research has gone since. So far, I've been telling you about compliance. So compliance is essentially the act of just agreeing to something. But consent is the act of agreeing to something voluntarily. You know what you're agreeing to, and you're cognitively capable of agreeing. So it has these additional elements. And so ever since I sort of started studying consent, I've kind of moved into comparing compliance situations to consent. So consent requires that someone has full information, the capacity to agree, and also feels free to say no. But as we've seen, people in different situations think that it's more or less easy to say no. So if I'm asking someone for something, whether it's to vandalize a library book, to do me a favor, or to go on a date, I think it's easier for that person to say no than that person thinks it is. And what that means is I may see them as consenting to something, and they feel like they're only complying. They don't actually feel like they were free to say no. So this applies in police search contexts, which is where myself and my co-author, who is a law professor, have been studying consent in. So this is often talked about as the problem of consent search. I'll just give you a quick history, sort of legal history of consent search, even though I am not a legal scholar. So in the United States, the Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable search and seizure. And most of us, especially if we watch things like Law and Order, most of us think that this means that you need a warrant to search, right? We imagine this kind of like come back with a warrant moment that you see on these shows. And you assume that unless someone has probable cause and has legally gone through all the things that are required to get a warrant, that they can't search. But there are exceptions to that. And so it turns out that as long as an officer asks to search and you agree, they can search whatever they want. This is called voluntary consent. All they need you to do is say, yes, you can come into my house. Yes, you can search my car. Yes, you can search my bag. And that is completely legal. And they don't have to have any reason to ask. They just need you to say yes. So this is called voluntary consent. And interestingly, as much as we have this image of getting a warrant to get consent, over 90% of searches are actually conducted by voluntary consent. Someone just asks and the person says yes. So they don't go through any of the sort of red tape of getting a warrant. Interestingly, to determine whether consent is legal in these cases, the person has to feel like they voluntarily agreed. So this idea of could that person say no is front and center when it comes to determining whether consent was actually legal. And the way that it's often considered is that you look at the officer's behavior. Did this person speak politely? Did they have their gun out? Right? Did they do anything overtly intimidating? Even if a police officer is sort of, all suited up and in his uniform says, if he just says politely, may I please search that? That is considered voluntary consent. There was nothing there that was overtly sort of pressure or coercive. Interestingly, as well, almost no one says no to these requests. So when we looked at the literature, it turns out there are cases where 99.9% of people in, for example, traffic stops will just say yes, which suggests that people don't really feel like they can say no to an officer, even when they're asking politely to search. So this work eventually was written up in the New York Times, and we posted it on social media. And I was really pleased to see, I was worried how police officers would react to this work. I thought that they would either push back or feel like we were, making it harder for them to do their jobs or something. But they basically told us that we were right in terms of what I'm about to show you, this idea that people don't say no to police officers. So this is what one person wrote back to us on social media. He said, I worked for the biggest police department in my state, 14 years in NARC. I was always amazed that everyone always consented to a search, even one guy with 100 pounds of marijuana in his suitcase. So this really did resonate with the experience that officers have, that people don't say no when you ask to search their person or their belongings. So the last question and the last set of data I'm going to show you is this question of whether people tend to overestimate how voluntarily a person consents to a search. So we saw that we underestimate how hard it is to say no to basic requests. This is another one where if a police officer, or in our case, we're just going to use ordinary research assistants, ordinary undergraduate research assistants dressed in their street clothes, do we think that people are consenting more voluntarily when they agree to be searched than they feel like they're doing? So to look at this question, we set up a situation in the lab where we had participants come in, we seated them in a room, and we had one of our undergraduate RA experimenters walk in and say, before we begin the study, can you please unlock your phone and hand it to me? I'll just need to take your phone outside the room for a moment to check for some things. So then we asked them a number of questions. How free would you feel to say no to this request? How easy was it to say no? How pressured did you feel, etc.? So we got a sense of how hard it was for them to say no in that moment. We also randomly assigned another group of participants to just read about this possibility. We said, we're thinking about doing a study like this. Would you agree to unlock your phone and hand it over? And how hard would it be for you to do all these things? So this is what we found. The two bars on the right are the people who are imagining the situation. We tell them we're thinking about running a study where we have you unlock your phone and we search through it. Would you hand over your phone, and would a reasonable person hand over your phone? As you see, most people say no, right? It's a minority of people who say they would unlock and hand over their phone. And we compare these people to the people who were actually asked. And this is what we find. 97% of people in our studies, and it ranges from studies, we've run a bunch of different versions now. It ranges anywhere from 85% to this is one of the highest ones. But the vast majority of people just unlock their phone and hand it over. And at this point, we've run it with college students. We've run it with adults in a downtown city lab. We've run all sorts of variations where we tell them we're going to look at their web search history. We've run studies where we've told them there's no penalty to saying no. None of it changes this fundamental dynamic that in the moment, they just can't figure out how to say no. And so they unlock their phones and hand it over to us, even though they say that this is something they would not do. All right, so to summarize what I've shown you so far, people are less likely to say no than we think. This applies to help requests, unethical requests, romantic requests, and even search requests. Saying no looks easier from the outside. We think it should be easy to say no, but in fact, when we're in that position, it's a lot harder than we realize from the outside. This means that we may see someone as having consented to a request when they just feel like they complied, like they didn't really have a choice. All of this means we have more influence than we think because people will agree to do things for us more than we think. And then that's good and bad. It means if we need help, people are more likely to help us than we think. But it also means that if we sort of ask for things that maybe we shouldn't, people don't feel as comfortable pushing back to us as we might think. And I'll just quickly summarize that this is one of many ways that we underestimate our influence. So we underestimate people's likelihood of doing things for us if we ask. There's other research suggesting that people notice us more in situations than we think, that we feel like we're kind of invisible, but people actually do see us. There's other research showing that people think about the things we say long after we say them, even though we don't see that, right? They do it in private, and we don't realize that the words that we say actually linger and fester and keep reverberating in other people's minds. So there are lots of different ways we seem to underestimate our influence over others, and this is just one that I've been studying for quite a while. So with that, I'll thank you, and I'd love to hear any questions or thoughts that you have.
Actually, I'll ask while I'm walking over there. One of my questions is, if people have a hard time saying no, what would you recommend as ways to learn to say no? Role playing, practicing, saying it out loud? You can answer that while I walk over here.
That's great. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. We find there's a couple things. So one is it's a lot easier to say no by text or email or non-face-to-face means. So one of the first things to do is to not, if someone's asking you face to face, is to not feel pressured in the moment and say, I'll get back to you. So that does two things. It buys you time to think of what you want to say. And it also allows you to get back to them in a way that you feel comfortable with. So maybe you send them an email or maybe you call them later, but you're not making this kind of gut reaction response when you're put on the spot. So we find that that's one of the most effective things, is just buying yourself time. And then there's also sort of having a phrase at the ready. If you know you're going to be asked for something, like when you go to the grocery store and you know that they're going to ask you to donate, if you sort of have a phrase at the ready, it's a lot easier to know what to say and not be kind of figuring out how to say no. So, you know, for example, I always say, oh, I already donated this year. And also having a phrase that can kind of, that you still feel good about. You don't just have to say no and make it awkward. It's something that, so I already donated this year, still makes me seem like a good person, right? So I'm not just saying like, no, I'm not going to do that. Or, you know, something that says like, not this time, I already did that. You know, something that kind of says like, I'm still a good person, which is what we worry about. We worry we're going to say no and we're going to sound like a bad person. But having a phrase like that can be really helpful.
So in this era of very polarized politics, are there any lessons about from your research about how you should ask people and approach people in order to influence their political decisions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, oh, I'm sorry. Yes. The question was, in these polarized political times, is there anything to take from my research on sort of how to influence people of different political perspectives, right? Does that pretty much summarize your question? So I don't look at that specifically. I do think, so I've actually played around with ideas of doing studies around this. And I do think that asking for things face to face and having conversations face to face is a huge part of sort of being able to influence other people's perspectives. I think a lot of the times we try to do these things, you know, over text now. I mean, social media is a horrible place for political discourse. So I think seeing people, kind of humanizing people by actually talking to them face to face. A lot of my work shows that face to face makes a huge difference, that we're more impactful, that it humanizes both people, that there's more of a social connection. And so I think that's number one. And then this isn't my work, but Jonah Berger is one of the people I put up there as a sort of follow-up to Dale Carnegie's book, because he's written a bunch of books on influence. And he talks a lot about finding higher order common values to influence people of different political perspectives, because a lot of the times we won't agree on the sort of actual policies and practical, like sort of lower level items, but we can get someone to agree that I value education, or I value, you know, some sort of higher order value. And you start there by finding common ground. And then you see the other person as having sort of positive pro-social goals because you both value something, you know. And so you identify that value, and then you try to work down and show that, well, we have different ideas about how to accomplish that value, but we can keep going back up to that thing that we agreed on is important, right? So those are two quick answers to a huge topic.
Yeah, I think that perhaps an interesting research question would be, why is it hard for people to say no? I have a couple of hypotheses, and one of them, certainly with a police officer, is you're afraid that if I say no, you can't, you're going to write up a ticket for me for sure. If I say yes, you can, and you don't find anything, you might say, oh, okay, we'll drive more carefully now. So that's one scenario. The other one is that no shuts the door to a discussion, and you might want to know more about what the offer is before you say no to it.
Yeah, so I think we try to differentiate situations where there's a tangible, practical consequence of saying no. Like, I might get hurt in some way by saying no. I might lose information. I might get in trouble in some way. So we try to, so there are definite sort of tangible things you could point to and say, saying no in this situation is dangerous for some reason or could hurt me in some way. we try to look at the situations as much as possible, stripping that out, even if there's no tangible negative consequences. Why is it still so hard to say no? And so I have a paper I've been working on kind of trying to articulate that. And what I usually say is that it comes down ultimately to our need to be connected to other people. So evolutionarily, we don't want to be disconnected from the group. That's just baked into our genetics. And part of that is that we don't want to be rejected from the group, but we also don't want to reject the group, because that's the same thing, just the opposite direction. And we forget that that's also very painful, to reject the group. And so that's part of it. We also, we worry about what saying no says about us, again, and what that could mean for our connections to others. So we worry that it makes us look like we're not a good person if we're saying no to like a help request. We worry that, we don't look like a hard worker if we say no to a work request. So we have impression management concerns. We worry about hurting other people's feelings and offending them in some way by saying no. So we worry about the other person's reputation. And then we worry about damaging the relationship. That if I say no, this person asked me because I thought that this was something I would do and that we have this kind of relationship. By saying no, I'm basically saying, no, we don't have that kind of relationship. And so those three things, like how I look to others, what I do to others, what I do to the relationship, can all kind of separate us from the group in ways that we're kind of wired not to want, right?
Our next question on Zoom is, does race or ethnicity matter? Who is asking? Who is responding?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's usually the first question I get, actually. So we don't have enough data to answer it really well. We do. So the last studies I showed you, because of the policing context, we were really careful about making sure that we looked at race. And so we do have studies there where we have a majority Black male population who's responding, and we find the same effects. So in those contexts, we definitely find the same kinds of findings, and it doesn't really depend on race. But I don't have good answers to how it would impact these sort of help-seeking scenarios where we ask someone for help of a different race. It does wind up getting just really complicated, because you'd have to manipulate the asker's race, the askee, or the person who's being asked. You have to kind of look at the context. And so it's been more complicated to design a really clean study to understand that and be able to sort of definitively answer that than we have hoped. But it is an important question, and one that we are definitely actively trying to answer.
I think we have time for one more, maybe two if they're fast.
What about age? I don't find it difficult to say no.
Yeah, I get that. That's usually the second question I always get about age. So I think this is we do look at age. We don't find a difference, but usually, in our samples, because they're convenient samples, age tops out around like late 30s, right, in our samples. But a lot of people think that like that 18 to 22 age is going to be really different from that 35 age. We don't find that to be true. My intuition is that there might be some difference based on age, but that it's another place where we overestimate how much it really matters and how good we are at saying no. So there's a lot of research saying we all think we're good at saying no, but we're not. So I wonder if that plays into place. Also, it's funny because whenever I get asked about age, I think of my mother, who's in her 70s. And during COVID, she had like a delivery person come and ask to use the washroom at her house. And she was paranoid. My dad was very sick at home. She was paranoid about COVID. I mean, I guess not paranoid, like legitimately concerned about COVID. And she told me, she was like, your research just came like flashing in front of my eyes. I could not say no to this person. So I let them in and let them use the washroom, despite, having so much anxiety about it and really not wanting to do it. She couldn't say no. And so I always think of that example. And I think she would have thought she would have easily said no in that moment.
Is it a quick question? We have one last question.
What do you think about the freedom to agree or not to agree that one gets from the software companies, where there's only one box?
Oh, yeah. This is actually, our newest research is on exactly that. There is so much interesting research right now in law, especially actually, looking at the psychology of agreeing to these terms and conditions. It's all, the basic understanding is that it's all a charade, that this idea that we're consenting when we agree to these things that have no boxes, and that we don't actually, what am I going to do? Stop using my phone? Like, they ask me if I'm like, I don't like that term, so I guess I'm going to throw away my expensive phone that has everything on it. It's not true consent. And so we're looking at exactly that. I'll tell you a really quick story related to that, but I took my kids to Universal last year, and, expensive flight, expensive tickets, get up early in the morning, stand in the longest line of all time, get to the front of the line, and they're like, fingerprints, please. And we were like, what? We have to give our fingerprints at Universal? And so we were actually giving our fingerprints to this for-profit company that we did not expect. But in the moment, we were like, what are we going to do? Take the kids out of line, fly back to New York? Like, we have no choice but to give this company our fingerprints. And so it just felt like that was not consensual at all.